Hello everyone. Welcome to this fourth session. I'm Rodrigo Perez Ortega. I'm a staff writer at Science Magazine, which is my first proper job. Before, I did several internships and freelanced. So I'm still learning how to negotiate contracts and salaries because that's something I had to learn on the go. And I wish I had a session like this one when I was starting out. I'm here with my co-organizer, Bethany. Um, do you mind introducing yourself, please?
Hi, I am Bethany Brookshire. I'm a freelance science journalist. I am the reason that you guys didn't receive the email on Monday, and my apologies for that. I sent it to myself. So here we are. And my apologies for that. But yes, I'm very excited to hear all of the stuff that Kendall and Shannon have to say.
Thank you, Bethany. Let's move on to today's mentors. Let them introduce themselves and mention, a little bit about themselves. Shannon?
I'm Shannon Paulus. I'm a senior editor at Slate. I cover mostly science and health. I also am the editorial director of The Waves, which is a podcast about gender and feminism. I try to sneak in science and health into Waves episodes as often as I can. I freelance a little bit here and there, and I was a freelancer for 2.5 years earlier in my career. Oh, and I'm also I was a member of the Slate Union Bargaining Committee in fall and through December and January. Thank you so much. We ratified a new contract for all Slate Union employees. So I still feel a little exhausted from that and have some stories to tell.
Great. Thank you, Shannon. That's great about the union. And now we have Kendall Powell. Hi, Kendall.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'm Kendall Powell. I'm based near Boulder, Colorado. I am a freelancer who has been freelancing my entire career. And that is now, I'm in my 19th year of freelancing. That makes me sound really old and kind of beyond mid-career, but I still consider myself mid-career. Let's see, a little bit about me. I was trained in cell biology. I made the jump to science journalism through a AAAS Mass Media Fellowship and then through the UC Santa Cruz program. I'm not quite sure how I became the soapbox owner for contract and rate negotiation for freelancers at NASW, but I have been doing a lot of work in that area for NASW for many years. I was the freelance committee co-chair for many years and a member of that committee for many years. I am now the board liaison to that committee and your friendly NASW secretary at the moment. I also do work with the Authors Coalition of America. I am our NASW representative there, and that is a group of groups like NASW, mainly other creators, writers, photographers, graphic artists, authors of all kinds, press photographers, and dramatists. And through that group, I learn a lot about contracts and negotiation and copyright, way more about copyright than I ever really wanted to know, quite honestly. And so that's me. And Shannon and I are very much of the same mindset. Yay for the union wins there. And you might have noticed that there were some legal disclaimers put on this session, and I will just make a little note. It's in a chat, it's in the Slack. This is to keep NASW out of hot water in terms of antitrust laws in America. So everything you hear today is really just best practice and standards in our field. We are not encouraging you to do anything specific in your negotiations and your contracts. We are just giving you information to make your own individual decisions as you see fit. This is for educational purposes only. And that is the end of my disclaimer.
Thank you so much. Basically, yes, all the legalese language will be, it will be, I don't know, Bethany, if you can help me copying it on the chat.
Yeah, sorry, Zoom will not let you actually copy paste text. You can only copy paste links. So I am copy pasting all the text and all the links. It is going to be in the contracts and negotiations channel. And I will also put it in the general channel just to be abundantly clear.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes. But basically what Kendall said, you know, this is just educational purposes and we're not telling you what to do at every situation, because that's up to you. But we are happy to help with advice, basically. All right, so well, let's start with Kendall. When I was in grad school, Kendall gave us this contract class or lesson, and it was kind of like eye-opening because that's something you don't learn often, or you don't have a lesson on like how to negotiate contracts, or even what is a good contract when you're a freelancer, right? And that's how I know she's a contract rock star. So I would like to start the session with a rundown of what a good contract looks like, with advice from Kendall and also from Shannon. Please feel free to chime in when you think there's good additions from your side.
Yeah, so I have just sort of my general thing, which is please do not work without a real contract in hand and in place. I've learned over the years that many science writers do this, right? You have a verbal agreement with your editor, or you have an email. And yes, technically emails are considered legally in US courts, but trust me when I say that all of the class grievances that we've seen come from places like Nautilus magazine had a big one. Earth magazine had one a couple of years ago where a whole class of writers gets left in the lurch and unpaid. It's really hard to get paid if you don't have a contract. And so although that doesn't happen often, it does happen. I think every freelancer I know has had a grievance happen at some point where they're either late in getting a payment or they are not paid at all. And it's much, much harder to fix those grievances and get paid if you don't have an actual contract in place. So this is just my general advice. Contracts are there to protect you. They're there to protect the editor and the publication. So there are times when you need to be able to point back to that language and say, hey, my contract actually says this, and we all both signed it, and so you need to honor it. Well, Shannon and I will say this a lot, I think, this session. It's not personal when you're negotiating a contract, it's business. Same with rates. It's not personal, it's business. And it really helps to think of it that way, to remind yourself often that negotiating is actually a sign of professionalism, and that you know what you're talking about, and you know the field and the standards in the field, and you are trying to get you're trying to get a mutual agreement that protects both of you and that you both are comfortable and happy with. So it behooves you to read your contracts, to make sure you have a contract, and to pay attention to the few parts that I'm going to cover today. And I would also encourage you to make yourself, at least every other once in a while, make yourself ask for changes to your contract. When you know there's something in there that's not good for writers, you are very likely to get shot down with an answer that says, our lawyers say we can't change it, from your editor. And that is fine, and it happens a lot. But I would encourage you to do it anyway. When we all individually negotiate our contracts and our pay rates, it's good for the whole field. It makes for healthier contracts and healthier pay rates for the whole field. It also makes you look smarter, like you know what you're talking about. So, all right, that's the end of my disclaimer. I think also I'll just say that, asking for changes, asking for negotiations, again, it's business, it's not personal. It should not cost you work. It should not cause you to lose face with an editor. It should not cause them to make you think less of you, to make the editor think less of you. I don't know if Shannon wants to chime in on that part, but you shouldn't be afraid that negotiation is going to somehow ding you with your editor or a publication.
Yeah, I would say that as long as you're firm but polite and don't I've had people write back when they get the contract, like, this is the worst contract I've ever seen, and like say, like use a lot of adjectives and hyperbole, and be clear but straightforward with your editor. When you're talking to your editor, particularly about contracts, this is like where I think understanding that it really is business is helpful. You're not talking to like your editor, the person, you're not even talking just to your editor. Your editor's job is not like figuring out the contract and setting the rates for the publication usually. If you email me a question about your contract or push back on some part of the contract, I take that to my boss, to our like managing editor, to the legal side, and I say, hey, I have this writer asking this, how do we handle it? So your editor is really a conduit to the business people. So don't take it out on them personally, and don't feel like you're insulting your very nice, kind editor if you're saying, hey, I actually like don't agree with this paragraph in the contract. They didn't write it.
Right. So, so what are the parts? So contracts are boring. They're dry. They're legalese. Nobody likes reading them, but I'm going to give you my 5 parts that I think you should pay attention to as a science writer. And these are the places where, I think if you see something that doesn't feel writer friendly or could be better, that's where you should think about pushing back. The first is going to be the rights section. So, these days, the sort of the best situation you can sort of possibly hope for, I think these days, is to get shared rights right off the bat, the first day after publication. That's pretty rare to see these days. I can't think of a single client I have myself that offered me that first off. So I think it's much more common to see 90 days exclusive rights to the publication. And after 90 days, you have shared rights. That is usually kind of the best deal you'll get these days. What I don't like to sign and what I don't like to see are work made for hire contracts. And the difference between those is that a work made for hire contract means that as soon as you turn over the work, so the first draft typically of the work to that publication, they own the copyright and they own it as theirs. And they can do, and a lot of the clauses in a work made for hire contract will say this, they can do whatever they want with it. They can keep your name on it. They can take your name off of it. They can put your picture by it. They can edit it however they like. That makes me nervous as a journalist. So I will say I've certainly signed work made for hire contracts for non-journalism work. When you're writing something that is a bit promotional or PR, I'm less concerned that they're going to make it look, make me or it look bad. Sometimes my name isn't going to be on it, and I know that ahead of time. So there's certainly conditions or times when I think work made for hire can be appropriate. It makes me much more nervous for a journalism piece to be a work made for hire. Now, this is one of those things you will sometimes get sent the contract. And if you say, I don't like this work made for hire, can we talk about 90 days exclusive rights? You will get an answer that our lawyers will not change this. And then you'll have to decide, is it worth it to you or not? What is the risk to you in signing a work made for hire contract? There's also a sort of I think open secret in the field that a lot of places will send you the work made for hire contract first, but there is another option. There is a 90-day exclusive rights contract. And so if you simply ask for, do you have another version? Do you have a 90-day rights contract? You will often sometimes just get sent a different version. So it's worth asking about that. It's worth pushing back on that. But you will not always be successful. In all of these cases, you may not be successful, and you will and then it's a personal decision. Am I okay with these payment terms? Am I okay with these rights terms? Is it worth it to me for other reasons? And there certainly are good reasons. If it's a work made for hire contract that doesn't have risk involved and it's a super great pay rate, sure, maybe that's fine. If it's a clip you really want, maybe that's fine. And again, with negotiations, I would say, you can always return to them. So at any point in time and you're working with a publication, you can ask to renegotiate your contract. You can ask to renegotiate your rate. It's not a one and done situation ever. So, so keep that in mind too. All right. The second section, I'm going to try to whip through these really fast. The second section, to me, most important section of all is the payment terms in the contract. Let's see, I try to present like what's the best possible scenario. So the best scenario these days is to see something that says you're paid upon acceptance. And it defines what acceptance is within the contract. So I have a few like this where they say acceptance is once it is ready to go to copy editing, or acceptance is after 2 rounds of substantive editing with your editor. From there, it usually goes to upon publication is pretty good if you get it right when it gets published. A lot of contracts will say we'll pay you 30 days after publication. So a whole month will go by before it will get processed. And then there's the ones that just go up from there, 60 days, 90 days, 120 days. I always try to negotiate this back to 14 days after publication at most. And the reasons I give editors and their bosses when I negotiate that is that if something goes wrong with a payment, which often happens just in like accounting, if I have to wait 30 days to realize I didn't get the payment, and then something happened and I tell them and I say, hey, I didn't get my payment, then another 30 days goes by before I get that payment. And that is 2 full months after I have done, at least 2 full months after I've done the bulk of the work. And I just sometimes lay that out. And that is sometimes enough of an argument to say, I'm not a vendor. I'm not, making me wait 60 days is really kind of ridiculous. I'm one person and I need to get paid in a reasonable time frame. So I have a lot of contracts that I have gotten to that 14 days after publication. Kill fee clause. So I definitely want to see a kill fee clause in my contracts. A lot of contracts don't have them at all. And so you have to ask if you can put one in. They're very variable in terms of what they offer. The best possible situation is to have a kill fee clause that defines that if a story is killed through no fault of the writer, so, scheduling reasons, what have you, and this is standard practice at a lot of places, but it's not always written out in the contract. You should get 100% of the fee for a story that gets killed for publication reasons, for other reasons beyond your control. And it's best if it says that in the contract. Otherwise, the kill fee clause usually refers to what happens when a story is killed because you come to an editorial disagreement and you can't get beyond it. So you've done everything, to sort of work it out with your editor and you can't. And in those cases, I like to see a kill fee of 50%. That's what I consider standard. That's what I often ask for if I don't see it. Some will offer you a sliding scale depending on how much work you put into the piece before it was killed. Some will offer 25% or lower. I've seen a third. So it can be any sort of range in there, but you want a kill fee. Again, it doesn't happen very often, but when it does, you want to have a contract that has a kill fee clause in it so that you get some compensation for that work you did. All right, finally, the tricky ones. Warranties and indemnities. So these two kind of go together. They're 2 different clause sections in most contracts, but they often rely on each other and go together. Basically, the warranties is the place where it says, you warranty that this work is original to you, that it is not going to infringe anyone else's copyright, privacy, you're not going to commit libel or slander, blah, 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 all those things you shouldn't do as a journalist. And then the indemnity is a clause that says that it often says that you agree to indemnify and hold harmless as the writer, you indemnify the publisher. And what this basically boils down to is that if a lawsuit comes about from your piece, you're on the hook to pay the court costs of that lawsuit. It's a huge thing to put on the shoulders of a freelance writer, and it's unfair and scary, and there's all sorts of reasons why they exist in contracts. We see them more and more, and these are things that in the best case scenario, you wouldn't have an indemnity clause in a contract. It would say that if a court case came up, all you agree to is to cooperate with the defense. that is provided by the publication. That's the best case scenario. It's very rare to see that these days. So there's a quick language fix that you can do to limit your risk as a freelancer. Obviously, it's a huge thing if you would have to take on the court costs of a lawsuit. So one piece of advice is, make sure you don't commit libel or slander or copyright infringement when you write your piece. I mean, that sounds trite, but it's true. This is actually your best protection. This comes from a media lawyer who I worked with on a report about media liability for NASW many, many years ago, but it has not changed. That is one of your first lines of protection. Be really careful in your work, don't commit those things. But here's a couple of quick language fixes. When you see a warranty and indemnity clause in your contract, you can first ask to strike the indemnification. This rarely ever works. I have not heard of a recent success story in this anytime recently. So what I've had more success with is just popping in some really quick but important language changes to those clauses. And I'll just read you sort of the right way to set it up. And this is actually an actual contract of mine from a major journal that rhymes with compliance. And so it's my contract with them. And when I first got it, and this was 2016, so it was a while ago, but my contract today still has these changes in it. So, I negotiated these changes to make this sort of the least risky possibility for me as a freelancer. And what it is that in the warranties, you need to have the phrase in there that says, to the best of the contractor's or author's or writer's knowledge, right? So I will not do these things to the best of my knowledge. I will not commit libel or slander or violate copyright or infringe anyone's privacy. And then in the indemnification part of the clause, you need to have the language that says, so usually it says something like, the contractor shall defend, indemnify, and hold the publisher harmless from and against all claims asserted by a third party and related damages, losses, including attorney's fees, arising out of the work. So that is not what you wanted to say, because you could claim anything arose out of the work and it was your fault. That's what that says if you sign that. What you wanted to say is that that part should say arising from an actual breach of the above warranties, an actual breach, not an alleged breach, not a vague arising out of the work. And if you have those two phrases in those two clauses, what this means is that you as the writer have to have knowingly breached those warranties to be on the hook for the lawsuit. And quite honestly, I think that's fair. If you knowingly committed libel, then maybe you should have to pay for that lawsuit. That is probably the best way to protect yourself these days with an indemnity clause in a contract. Having an LLC or an S Corp does not offer you liability protection from that scenario. If you commit a wrong in one of those torts in US law, you as an individual committed the tort, so having a business entity does not protect you from that liability. They do protect you in other cases, breach of contract, and it is good for other reasons to set those things up for tax purposes or for keeping your personal and private money separate, your business and your private money separate, but they do not protect you in this case. We can talk more about that later if people have questions, but there is an option to buy media liability insurance through the Freelancers Union, which is free to join. The Freelance Committee has researched this, and that is the best option out there available. They are individual policies through a company. So you fill out a quote for you, and they come back and tell you they come back with a quote. You fill out the type of work you're doing, and they come back and offer you a quote. And those have been the most comprehensive and affordable option that we found. So if you're writing something that's investigative a lot, if you're writing about medical information, if you're writing about controversial topics, you might want to seek out a media liability policy for yourself. And that will also give you added protection. That is a lot. Ask me anything on the Slack channel. I'm happy to respond there. I'm sorry if you've heard this spiel before because you're a UC Santa Cruz alum. Yeah, I've given this talk before. So yeah, that's that.
I think that's great. Super great, Kendall. That's like a very boiled down questions, rundown of everything. But I think some advice from me is just to, someone you trust, ask them if they have, like, if you don't have a good contract or an example of a good contract, I've asked other colleagues, like, hey, can you share your contact with me, like confidentially, or just like share the language that you think it's good. So I just compare it with other contracts I get from outlets. And then I can use that language that I know is good to like push back and say, hey, actually, can we change this, or can we make this like specific change? And that's just a very helpful advice, especially coming from someone who doesn't know law or legalese language. So thank you for that, Kendall. Shannon, as an editor, what are some of the best practices around negotiating rates with freelancer and contracts, and how do you, when a freelancer comes with you with questions about a contract, what's the best way to do it?
So first, I want to make a point around Kendall's excellent "don't commit libel" piece of advice. If you think that if you know you are working on a controversial story, ask your editor up front if their publication is going to be able to get a lawyer to read it over. We lawyer staff pieces that are controversial. We also can lawyer freelance pieces that are controversial. See if your publication has a system in place to help make sure you don't libel someone. When you get into topics around misconduct and harassment and businesses, you have to be very careful about how you phrase things, and we pay other people to do that. And in general, if you're worried that what you might be saying might, be libel or not even libel, just incorrect, flag it for your editor and talk about it together. You don't have to be perfect all on your own, especially when you're dealing with really sticky topics. On the front of negotiating contracts, I am always happy to field questions about them, but as an editor, the contracts are a little bit of a black box for me. Contract negotiation is not my job, it's assigning and editing stories. So I'm going to try to loop you in with someone else on our team as quickly as possible, but don't hesitate to ask. And if we end up parting ways over a contract, I always say this, but like truly no hard feelings. If it's not a good fit for you and your needs, that's fine. And also, if you can state clearly why, a contract or even a fee isn't going to work out, I can go give that feedback to my bosses and say, hey, we're losing freelancers over XYZ. And that's the little bit of leverage that I have. In terms of negotiating rates, I think that this varies publication to publication. I'm just going to say that Slate's rates are very low. So I never ever mind if you come in a little hot on rates. If you say like, this is, I typically work for $2 a word or whatever, I'm not going to be able to offer you that, but that's not like, you're not offending me if we're not a fit in that regard. What I will say is, if I throw out a rate and you want to get something that's a few $100 above that, your best bet is to show me things that have done well, like share clips, share experience, help me prove to my boss that this is worth spending a bigger chunk of our budget on. I think, oh yes, pass on threats is the note that I have in the script here. Sometimes I will see people subtweeting editors on Twitter, and say it to your editor's face. That is useful information for us to share with our companies. If you're going to move on from a publication because of late payments, if you're going to move on from a publication because of a contract thing, I want to know that. I want to have that information. My goal as an editor is to give writers the best experiences that I can with the resources that I have available to me. And I'm only able to advocate for more resources if I have ammo to do that. And yeah, be direct.
Thank you, Shannon. Like, yeah, directness is always a good policy. Um, we have some questions on the chat that I very quickly want to go to because I think they were not clear. Basically, what is when there is no contract, who owns the right, the rights? And on that note, also, how would you define shared rights, and what does that entail with what you can do with your piece? Maybe Kendall or Shannon can explain a little bit.
Sure. If there is no contract in US law, and I'm not as familiar with other, there is differences. There are a lot of differences in media law between between countries. And so it is good to know what is what in the country that you're most often writing for. Libel law in particular is hugely different between the British system and the UK system and the American system. So dig around if you're writing for somewhere else. In US law, if you do not have a contract, you, the writer, are always the copyright holder if there is not a contract in place. So that's a good thing. That's a writer-friendly thing that we have in our law. Shared rights are usually spelled out in the contract that has shared rights. So if you have a 90-day exclusive and then shared rights, it will often, spell all of those out. And yes, they are mostly, so I will say I do have a contract that has shared copyright, and that's a weird thing. But that does exist. I do have contracts that are 90 days exclusive rights and then shared rights, where I always own the copyright to the piece and not the publication. So yeah, you have to read to figure out kind of where your rights are. I was trying to find an example, but the shared rights that I care about are reprinting and republishing, translations. Right. So you will often have people come to you wanting to reprint your story, republish it, use it as a textbook question sometimes. Those are actually quite lucrative because, again, no more work on your part, but you get paid something for it. So if you're past that 90-day mark or whatever it might be in your contract, if someone comes directly to you, then you can negotiate that with them and get a fee for republishing or reprinting or translation. Those are the ones that pop out. There's other things too, but those are the things that I think most writers end up, using in their shared rights. So did that answer it? I think that's.
Yeah, no, totally. And I know for freelance writers, especially, is very, some income comes from republishing rights. So that's something you learn, like after, I don't know, a year, that somebody wants to republish and you're like, oh, let me look up my contract, but if you have that policy of shared rights, you can totally negotiate that rate and or translating, and it's usually good. Any extra income is welcome, right? When we have another question, when does one actually need to consult or hire a lawyer regarding contracts?
In my experience, the only writers I know who have done that are usually looking at book contracts, which are a little bit of a different beast, much bigger and more detailed. And I think that's a good move, and I think it's usually worth it. For freelance contracts, I guess I shouldn't say that. I do know of at least one case with a very big, very glossy publication that often, spends things out into TV shows and movies. And there was a secondary rights that they wanted to negotiate with this very big player in our field, one of the biggest, maybe the biggest. And they hired a lawyer to do that because, paying a lawyer $500, for them to take a look, maybe $500 to $1,000 is probably what it would take just to take a look and tell you what it should say or how to approach it. was probably worth it in the end if they thought they were going to write an article that was going to get turned into a movie. So yes. But outside of those really big things, I'm not sure it's worth hiring a lawyer. I will say we have a partnership with the National Writers Union. NASW has a partnership with NWU. You can become a member of NWU for $150 through that partnership. You can also, we have 25 slots or so of free help. So they have a contract negotiation service where they have people on staff, or volunteers, I should say, who are sometimes lawyers by trade, and you can get, you know, free help with contract negotiation and with non-payment grievances. So please, you know, dig into that if you need that kind of help and you can't afford a lawyer. There's that. There's also volunteer lawyers for the arts, if you can find a local chapter, you know, and we are considered, freelance writers are considered in their artists. So there are services out there that are cheaper than hiring your own media lawyer.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation, Kendall. Moving on, because we are running out of time now. I wonder if there are some absolute no-nos when negotiating contracts and rates. Do you have any examples or, you know, some pet peeves that we should avoid? Shannon?
Don't be mean. Take no for an answer. And I think that's about it.
Yeah, we're all human, and remember that, right? Kendall, do you have any no-nos when doing that?
Yeah, I mean, my one biggie is, you know, if you're a freelancer, it's with freelance pay rates, don't ask for what you know is the top pay rate at a publication and then turn in crappy work. That would be my one. I mean, that seems really obvious, but you'd be surprised that people do this. And so I think that's something, you know, do your homework, know what a publication can pay, what their range is, and you do that homework by asking other people or consulting. You know, there are things out there like Who Pays Writers, there are spreadsheets out there floating around. You know, do your homework, figure out what is reasonable. If you're going to ask for the top rate, make sure you're, you know, you turn in that value to your editor. I think this goes back to, this is something that makes, you know, when we all negotiate well, it raises the whole field, you know, as we negotiate as individuals. If you do it poorly, it brings all of us down as well. So it works both ways. So.
Yeah, totally. Shannon, I'm curious to know if you can share something about how to approach a staff job position negotiation, because we have talked so far more on the freelance side, but also like, what do you do when they ask you to throw out the first salary figure or give your salary requirements? And if an audience member has also some advice on this, please raise your hand.
You do not throw out the first number if humanly possible. It's really hard. I do it all the time when I'm in job application mode. So this advice comes courtesy of Phoebe Gavin, who is a career coach and works in talent development at Vox. She came on my podcast, The Waves, a few weeks ago to talk about this exact question. And when you're talking to a recruiter about a job or having that first HR interview, and they ask you, how much would you like to make? You say, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I do not have enough information to answer it just yet. However, I'd love to hear if you have a budget set for this role. I can drop this in the Slack later. And the person might tell you a range. As of May 15th, I think jobs in New York have to put a range in the job description, which is awesome. And hopefully with remote jobs, we'll have impacts well beyond New York and Colorado. It's a rule in Colorado as well. And so hopefully the person who you're talking to is going to have that range, or you're already going to have that range. And if they won't tell you, maybe it's because they just aren't the person holding the budget at the moment. And if they keep pushing you to throw out a number, Phoebe Gavin advises saying, it sounds like you wouldn't be able to move me forward in this process unless I shared my private financial information with you. Am I reading that correctly or am I misunderstanding? And that's if they're really like, they're pushing you, they're pushing you. That's coming in really hard. Phoebe says they're coming in really hard at you. So just know that you are not like morally obligated to put out a number first.
I I see in the chat people love that language, and so do I. So thank you that. Like, yeah, just as you said first, let's keep it polite, you know. And I'm also wondering about another aspect. How do raises work? When you're in a staff job, but also when you're freelancing, how to raise your rates. After I did an internship, I started freelancing for science. Before being on staff, my editor he was the one who told me, you know, they would raise my freelancer rate without me mentioning anything. I was like, oh, I love my editor. I hadn't thought of that, and I didn't know how to ask about that, you know. So, and I still have the same question now that I'm on staff. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on that, what your thoughts are on that.
The short answer is that it's different in every publication, and the best thing you can do is ask. The more nuanced answer is when you hand in good work, when you've been working with someone for 6 months to a year, say, hey, I'm interested in discussing a raise. Maybe I like to tell people to have that first conversation sooner rather than later. Like have it when it's like first coming up in your mind and not when you've reached this, like, I'm almost at the brink of like losing my mind because I haven't gotten a raise. Because especially with staff jobs, there will be several steps in getting a raise. They have to approve it through HR or their boss or whatever. Maybe there's a certain time of year when they finalize the budget. If you can have that, like, hey, I'm interested in getting a raise, or I'd like to understand how raises work at this organization. Can you tell me more? You want to get that information as soon as you can. With freelancing, like, I think I don't have any like really concrete steps here, because it is just different from publication to publication. Like, for example, my budget is so tiny and my rates are so low to begin with that like I cannot necessarily be raising writers up in pay scale all the time. I try to do it naturally. Don't hesitate to ask. That's going to be like the take home lesson here. I don't know if Kendall has more to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually not that different from a staff job, I would think, too, in the sense that, you know, it's best to strike while the iron's hot, right? If an editor, if you've been working for an editor for a while and you know they rely on you or they're coming to you with assignments, they appreciate your work, then, you know, ask for a raise. And you use language like, hey, I've been for you for this many years now, or hey, you're sending me consistent work. Can we renegotiate my pay rate? You know, some of the language, you know, when they're asking you to do a big lift, or they've, you know, told you your work is fantastic, then those are good times to ask. I would also say I use language like, you know, hey, you know, my other clients in this space are actually paying me this now. And, you know, your competitors basically, or your market is paying me this rate now. Can you match it? That's language I use a lot. And yes, you know, I do sometimes, you know, I work those against, you know, I kind of work those numbers against each other so that I can consistently raise my rates over for the years to give myself a raise, basically. I would also say when someone comes to you with a rush job, a big job, a complex job, then I also bring out similar language. Hey, for this type of rush, for this type of complex thing you're asking for, I typically get paid X amount per word or X flat rate. Can you match that? That's, you know, those are my my strategies. And again, go find the data from those spreadsheets, go find the data from your friends and colleagues, ask around, what can you realistically expect to get? What's the cap? That's good information to know. Shannon's cap is very different from other publications caps. So you should really go and do your homework on that too. So what's possible and what's realistic, and that you're not asking for something ridiculous in their in their capacity. So
going back a little, Kendall, when you mentioned it in the beginning that you can renegotiate a contract at any time, have you had any experiences on, when you have an assignment and they're asking you to do more, or like go report more, or editing is taking too much or something, like, when is a good time to ask, this scope creep, kind of like say, hey, you're asking me to do more, can we renegotiate our rate, or give me more words or something like that?
As soon as you I would say as soon as you feel like there's scope creep, have that discussion with your editor. Again, this is not personal, it's business, and often they recognize, because it is creep, sometimes it starts in one place and it ends up in a much different spot. And so as soon as you feel that as a freelancer, I think, have that conversation sooner rather than later. I think it's harder for all kinds of reasons for the editor to grant you a raise at the end of a big project instead, than midway through or at the beginning stages. And so, it never hurts to ask. They can say no. You can say, then I can't do the 3 extra boxes you're asking me to do. I mean, it's all a negotiation. And at any point, you should feel like, if you feel like something is not being valued at what it should be, you should revisit it. And again, be polite, be respectful,
Yeah, thanks. I know maybe this one is for Shannon. We have a question from the audience. If you know that a publication has a small freelance budget or can pay you more than you want, can you instead, negotiate other aspects like less work or even more assignments? So like, if you can negotiate a rate, can you negotiate other aspects?
The aspects that are available for negotiation with me are deadline. So if you say, hey, that rate is lower than I'd like, but can I take a month to do this short piece? That's something that I might have more wiggle room on. Negotiating more assignments is tricky unless I work with you a lot. My budget is small. It is therefore difficult to assign you many things. That's kind of part and parcel of the same issue. I also, some people will negotiate on word count. Okay, you were thinking 1,000 words. Can I do 700? I'm fine negotiating on word count. I will say, in my experience as a freelancer, I often have even a harder time writing 700 words versus 1,000 words. One of the huge perks of working at Slate is you can be a little bit rambly and you don't necessarily need to be concise. So, but if a lower word count will help you as a freelancer at the particular pub, or that it will just help you in the way you work, that works well too. One thing that isn't necessarily a negotiation thing, but I try to emphasize with freelancers when I share pitch callouts and rates, is that I don't necessarily need original reporting from you, depending on the type of piece. So some pieces, yes, I want you to go interview people. Some pieces, personal essays, I do like a really good reported personal essay, but personal essays are opinion pieces where you've done reporting on the past, or everyone's covering a topic and you want to synthesize it in a new way and say, this is how I feel about this, and link out to information from other publications. Those are ways to decrease the scope of your work a little bit. So if I offer you $300, and you're like, it's not going to get me on the phone with people, but you envision another way to do the piece that doesn't require like phone calls, pitch it to me. We can talk about how to reduce your work scope a little bit in that regard.
Great. And beyond, just an assignment, also when negotiating, staff contracts, for example, and maybe the salary is not, there's not a lot of flexibility, what are other aspects you can negotiate? I'm thinking about paid time off, vacations, maybe some projects, things like that. Because that's also,
Paid time
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
all quality of life related things. Yeah, paid time off is kind of one of the white whales of staff job negotiation. I have a lot of friends who have asked for it at various places. I very rarely hear of someone getting more paid time off. Just because companies have policies and they're like, oh, this is actually like our health insurance, like everyone kind of gets the same deal. And then maybe it goes up with years of service. I don't think it hurts to ask, and maybe you'll get it. Another lesson that I learned from Phoebe Gavin, the career coach, is that negotiating title can actually be really beneficial for you sometimes. So if you can, and you want to have a title that aligns with the scope of your work, but we're creatives, so that's a little bit subjective sometimes. If you can get a senior or a director thrown in front of your title, for example, if you can make a case for that. Phoebe has talked about how she got, a senior thrown in front of a title for a job, and then she leveraged that in her next negotiation for another job outside of the company to move to like a director level for even more money. So anything that like kind of boosts you up the ladder. You can also ask for more leeway working on outside projects. So for example, say you're covering a particular beat at a publication you're joining, and they have strict rules about freelancing, or they have the very standard rule of like, you can't write for other publications on your beat. Maybe you can get like an allowance to like write for the New York Times occasionally on your beat, or pitch a high profile publication now and then on your beat to kind of further your career that way and get a little extra paycheck. I think two more spots actually you can negotiate. I've had friends who get sign-on bonuses at jobs, which I don't think most people know about. If they can't move higher on the salary, maybe they'll give you a sign-on bonus of like 5K, 15K. Sometimes it can be easier for them to find the money in their budget right now versus committing to year after year paying you extra. And lastly, you can negotiate on the scope of your job. Say you really want podcasting experience, and that the company you're going to has podcasts where they have writers guest host. Sometimes you can say, I will come on, but I want this to be a little part of my job. I want to learn this skill. And how else can the company help you further your career goals and further your marketable skill set? The other thing that companies often will throw out that I'm always a little wary of is they'll say, hey, if you come on, we'll consider you for a promotion in the next year or two. I think that it can work. It also doesn't work. I personally wouldn't go into a new job totally counting on that. It sounds a little squishy to me.
Kendall, as a freelancer, do you have other aspects beyond the rate that you think you can negotiate or are important to, sometimes we don't think about it?
Yeah, I think I don't think about it as maybe often as I should as a freelancer. I mean, I would say when you're a freelancer coming into a new situation, right, with a new client or a new gig, it is totally worth it to take 5 minutes to do the math on the rate, to figure out what it is hourly and what it is per word, or what the flat rate is, whichever one they give you, figure out the other one. Because yeah, there are things, and the more you do it, the more what takes you an hour, what takes you 5 hours, what it's going to take you. So I'm always a big proponent of doing the math. The other thing I would say, I mean, I've never asked for something other than a rate. I've never even asked for fewer words, which that's actually like really smart. Like, yeah, can I do it less? Can I do, or can I, or, I think I have had gigs where like, they're like, write as long as you want, it's easier. And so I know it's going to be an easier gig. There are things you can kind of figure out, well, this will be easier, so therefore taking a lower rate might be okay. I will say that as both a staffer and a freelancer, there's this concept you should think about, which in like, business negotiations is called a BATNA. It's your best alternative to non-agreement. And I think it's really smart to have it in your head, both when you're doing a salary job negotiation and a big freelance gig. So, and that is basically like, it's basically an idea of what else could I do? What other options do I have? I can stay doing what I'm doing with the clients I have, as a freelancer, or I can stay in the job I have as a staffer, or I have this other offer on this, on the table over here. What it prevents is it prevents you from taking an offer that's maybe in your window, but it's of what you would accept, but it's really on the low end. If you have an alternative that would pay your time better, or pay you better as a staffer, then it prevents you from taking that too low, what is really too low of an offer, and then resenting it later because you could have been doing something else. And I think that's a concept that as writers, we maybe don't think about. Like, I do have alternatives as a freelancer. There's plenty of other types of gigs I could be doing in place of this one that I'm thinking about right now. And so it just helps me from taking things, I speak from experience. I've definitely taken gigs where I'm like, that's good enough. And then you do the work and you're like, it really wasn't. And you hate yourself for it later because, you're like, why did I take that? I didn't have to as a freelancer. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind.
Yeah, that's great, Kendall. Thanks. I've definitely had that. And then I'm like, never again, but I'm glad I learned. We're close to the time for the recorded session. Shannon, do you have any other take-home messages from negotiations and contracts that you would like to share?
Yeah, one of my biggest take-home messages, it's okay to make mistakes in your negotiation. Kendall was talking about earlier about how you don't want to come in too hot and ask for the highest possible rate that a publication offers and then hand in total crap. If you're sitting there being like, oh my God, I've made that mistake before, it's fine. Maybe one editor won't want to work with you again. I think as a freelancer, I kind of had this idea that like editors were these gods and they were always talking to each other and they'd remember me forever. And it's just not. Like, any error you make it is not going to be that bad. I think that especially women and non-binary folks and people who are not socialized to think that like they can fuck up sometimes, can err on the meek side of things because they think, oh, if I'm rude, that's really gonna like have a dent in my life. And it's not. You're allowed to make mistakes. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that we didn't say it a lot in this session, but I think when we talk about salaries and rates, there's a little bit of a tendency to say, well, this is what I'm worth, and this is like, I'm worth more than this, I'm worth that. I really encourage people to separate out all of these conversations from the idea of worth and even the idea of I am. Like, we're talking about market rates for particular services here. That's it. Like, what will the market bear for the service that I'm offering at this time?
Yeah, that's great to keep in mind. Well, thank you both. We are finishing the recorded part of the session. This has been great. Now we will move on to the next part.